He slammed the man against the glass wall, and in the middle of the most glamorous casino floor in Atlantic City, 100 people went dead silent as 6 words came out in a voice cold as steel. Nobody touches what is mine, ever. But here was the problem: Tessa Monroe didn't belong to anyone. She was just a night shift waitress, an orphan carrying her dead father's debt on her shoulders, and a younger sister still in school. And Ronan Gallagher, the most powerful and feared man in this city, a man who for 12 years had let nothing and no one touch him, found himself drawn into the darkness late at night by a drink she mixed with her own hands. A drink better than any $1,000 bottle in his cellar. One that kept pulling him back to that small bar night after night. But what he couldn't understand was another drink, the one she mixed every single night and then quietly poured down the drain, without a word of explanation, for 2 whole years. Nobody could have guessed that those 2 drinks would pull 2 people from opposite ends of the world into a story that would make the entire underworld hold its breath. This is where everything changed for both of them. If this story already has your attention, hit subscribe so you don't miss what happens next. Drop a like and share it with someone who loves stories that touch the heart. Now, let's go back to where it all began. Ronan Gallagher didn't work according to anyone else's schedule. For the past 12 years, all of Atlantic City had learned that lesson in the hardest way possible. He didn't make appointments, didn't give notice, and didn't need anyone to prepare a thing for him, because what he wanted to see was precisely what people hadn't yet had time to hide. So when the black car stopped outside the rear entrance of the Meridian at 2 o'clock in the morning on a bitterly cold Tuesday near the end of November, not a single person inside that building, rising 18 stories above the street, knew their owner was about to walk in. Boyd opened the car door. Ronan stepped out, straightened the front of his coat, looked up at the towering mass of glass and light spilling across the wet sidewalk, and said exactly 4 words: "Take me through the place." Boyd didn't ask what he wanted to see. 20 years at this man's side had taught him that the question was unnecessary. The gaming floor revenue had failed to match the books for 3 weeks in a row. The discrepancies were small, carefully concealed and scattered thinly across hundreds of transactions, so no one would bother looking closely. But Ronan Gallagher had built his entire empire by paying attention to the things no one else thought worth noticing. They entered through the employee door, moved through the service corridor, and stepped out onto the main casino floor. At 2 o'clock in the morning, the casino was still as bright as day. Slot machines rang out in bursts, chips clicked against one another across green felt tables, someone laughed after winning, and the heavier silence of many others followed after they had lost. But within 10 seconds of Ronan setting foot on the carpet, the atmosphere in the entire hall changed. No one shouted a warning. No one announced his arrival. Still, the news spread like an electric current running beneath the floor. Dealers straightened their backs. Security officers adjusted their earpieces. The night shift manager, standing beside the cashier cage, suddenly discovered an urgent reason to walk in the opposite direction, only to be stopped by a single look from Boyd. Ronan moved slowly, both hands inside the pockets of his coat, his gaze traveling across each row of tables, like a blade passing over a whetstone. He wasn't watching the gamblers. He was watching his employees, watching how they stood, how they counted their chips, how some of them deliberately avoided looking in his direction, because after all those years he had come to understand one simple truth. Innocent people were curious. Guilty people kept themselves busy. At the end of the row of blackjack tables, he stopped. "The books don't balance," Ronan said, no louder than a breath. Boyd nodded. "Accounting says it could be a system error, sir." Ronan turned his head slowly and looked at Boyd with gray eyes that carried no emotion at all. "I didn't ask what accounting said. I asked why the books don't balance." Boyd remained silent. That silence was an answer in itself. No one knew yet. Someone inside this very building was clever enough to conceal what they were doing, and reckless enough to steal from Ronan Gallagher beneath Ronan Gallagher's own roof. 3 weeks, Ronan continued, his voice still as even as if he were reading a weather report. "The amount doesn't matter. What matters is the person who thinks I don't count." He drew one hand from his coat pocket and tapped 2 fingers lightly against the edge of the felt table, a gesture so small it was almost invisible. Yet the dealer standing 3 steps away suddenly felt sweat soaking his palms. "Narrow it down to floor management," Ronan said. "Match every shift against every discrepancy. Find them." "Today?" "Yes, sir," Boyd replied. Ronan remained there for another moment, taking in the whole magnificent hall as it pretended to continue operating as usual. Crystal chandeliers, gold-plated mirrors, Small human beings wagering their hopes on playing cards. All of it belonged to him. Every carpet, every chip, every contract, locked inside the safe on the highest floor. And yet, in all 12 years, nothing here had ever made him want to linger longer than necessary. He turned away, leaving the entire gaming floor behind him as it released a breath no one dared let him hear. And instead of heading toward the main exit, he turned into the eastern corridor, the shortcut through the Empire Room wing that led directly to his private elevator. Boyd started to follow, but Ronan gave the slightest shake of his head, and the man stopped exactly where the light ended and the darkness began. The Empire Room wing had been closed for 12 years. The stage was covered in canvas. Most of the rows of velvet seats had been removed, and an entire golden age of music and clinking glasses had become nothing more than a silent emptiness. People hurried through at night, so they wouldn't have to look at it. Ronan didn't hurry. He never hurried. His leather shoes struck the stone floor in a steady rhythm, one measured step after another, as though even the darkness had to stand in line and wait for him to pass. Then, in the exact center of that dark corridor, the feet of the most feared man in Atlantic City suddenly came to a stop. Not because of a sound, not because of a figure in the shadows, because of a scent. Orange peel scorched over flame, sweet and darkened at the edges, mingled with smoked honey and the warmth of whiskey. It was a real scent, made by the hands of a real person, drifting quietly through a place that should have smelled only of dust and things long forgotten. Ronan Gallagher stood motionless in the darkness, and for the first time in many years, he turned toward something that hadn't been part of his plan. He followed that scent the way a man follows a question. The wooden door leading into the Empire Room stood slightly open, and Ronan pushed it wider without making a sound. Inside, the vast room lay submerged in darkness, the stage covered in white canvas like a grave hastily filled, while the rear service area and the rows of employee lockers, sealed off 12 years earlier, remained silent behind locked doors. Only the bar at the front was still lit, the long wooden counter having been repurposed to serve the adjoining private lounge and employees finishing late shifts. And behind that bar stood a woman. She was turned partly away from him, her brown hair tied low at the nape of her neck, her sleeves rolled to the elbows, and she was making a single drink with the measured care of someone performing a ritual rather than preparing a cocktail. Ronan stood in the darkness and watched. She held a strip of orange peel over a small flame until the oils hissed and released a halo of sweet, scorched fragrance, dropped it into the glass, added a spoonful of thick, dark amber honey scented with smoke, then poured the whiskey in a thin, steady stream as though her hand had been fitted with a measuring rule. She stirred exactly 3 times, no more. Then she stopped. Her hand hovered above the rim of the glass, as though there were still something else she needed to do, some final step left unfinished, but she didn't do it. She only stood there looking at the drink for several seconds, with the gaze of someone waiting for something that would never arrive. And then, with a movement so decisive it was almost cruel, she tipped the glass and poured every drop into the sink. Ronan Gallagher had watched people burn money, destroy contracts, and throw away things worth fortunes in front of him, and not once had he felt any need to speak. But tonight, inside this abandoned room, he heard his own voice before he had even decided to use it. "You just poured away the best thing I've smelled anywhere in this building." The woman didn't startle. She didn't spin around, didn't drop the glass, didn't even tense her shoulders. She merely turned her head and looked at him over one shoulder, her brown eyes direct and clear, assessing him for exactly 1 second in the way someone might study a stranger standing on the porch of her home, without fear, only consideration. "The bar's closed," she said. Then she looked at him a little longer, from his face down to his coat, and whatever she saw didn't seem to be power or money, but something else, something far more tired. "But you look like a man who needs a drink. Sit down." No one spoke to Ronan Gallagher that way. No one told him to sit. People invited him to sit, asked permission to sit in his presence, waited until he had taken his seat before daring to lower themselves into a chair. Yet his legs moved before his pride could object, and he found himself sitting on the last stool at the end of the bar, where the yellow light barely reached him. "The drink you just made?" he said. "I want that one." She shook her head, a small final movement like closing a door. "That one isn't for sale." He looked at her. "Why?" "Because it isn't finished," she replied, "and it may never be." She said it evenly, without sadness and without inviting him to ask anything more, in the voice of someone who had placed her pain inside a drawer and locked it away a long time ago. Then she reached for a clean glass. "But if you want to know what it almost tastes like," she continued, "there's a draft." He frowned. "A draft. The original recipe isn't mine," she said, already holding a fresh strip of orange peel over the flame. "The draft is. It's close, but it goes somewhere different at the end. Are you drinking or not?" Ronan Gallagher, the man before whom the entire underworld of the city weighed every word with care, sat motionless on the last stool at the bar and said, "I'm drinking." She worked faster than before, though with no less precision. Burned orange peel, smoked honey, Irish whiskey, and then, at the final step, instead of stopping, her hand took a path of its own. A thin slice of crushed ginger, 2 drops of bitters, 1 slow stir. She placed the drink in front of him without offering a name. He lifted the glass and tasted it, and something happened that even he needed a moment to name. Beneath his house by the ocean, he had a private wine cellar filled with bottles of whiskey older than he was, labels men bid on by telephone from 3 continents. He had drunk all of them in the same way, quickly, neatly, without emotion, as though signing his name. But this drink was different. It wasn't expensive. It was real. The scorched sweetness of the burned orange peel dissolved first, followed by the soft smoke of the honey, then the warmth of the whiskey spread through his chest, as though someone had placed a hand over the precise place inside his ribs that had been frozen for years. At the very end came the gentle heat of the ginger, lingering like a reminder that this had been made by a human being, with a story of her own, for a reason of her own. Ronan drank slowly. He couldn't remember the last time he had drunk anything slowly. She returned to wiping the bar, not looking at him, not waiting for praise, as though his sitting there and taking his time with what she had created was his private concern and had nothing to do with her. It was that indifference, completely unintentional and without calculation, that made him set the glass down and ask a question he hadn't asked a single employee in all 12 years he had owned this place. "What's your name?" She glanced at him over her shoulder, and there was something at the corner of her mouth as dry and direct as the rest of her. "Tessa," she said. "And you drank without paying." He took out his wallet and placed a bill on the counter worth 10 times the price of a cocktail at any bar in the building. She picked it up, looked at it, then opened the register, counted out the change, and placed the exact amount in front of him, precise down to the last cent, no more and no less. "This bar doesn't take tips for 1 drink," she said, then turned away to put the whiskey bottle back on the shelf, leaving the most powerful man in Atlantic City sitting alone on the last stool at the bar, before an empty glass and a small stack of change that, for the first time in his life, he didn't know what to do with. The following night, Ronan came back. He told himself it was because of the audit, that a careful owner needed to be present while his books were being dissected, that 3 o'clock in the morning was a reasonable time to see how a casino operated when no one believed they were being watched. He told himself many things during the drive along the oceanfront boulevard, and not one of them explained why his feet carried him through the eastern corridor, past the wooden door of the Empire Room, and straight to the last stool at the bar. Boyd didn't ask. He merely entered the words audit supervision, night shift into the schedule, and kept the expression of a man so professional that he wouldn't permit himself to be surprised aloud. Tessa was turning freshly washed glasses upside down on the rack when Ronan walked in. She looked at him for exactly 1 second, offered no greeting, asked no question, and simply reached for the bottle of Irish whiskey and a strip of orange peel, as though an agreement had been signed between them the night before, and neither of them needed to mention it again. That night, she replaced the slice of ginger with a sprig of rosemary warmed over the flame, and when she placed the glass in front of him, she spoke the first words of the evening, "Closer or farther away?" Ronan tasted it, allowing the flavor to dissolve completely across his tongue before answering. "Closer." She gave the smallest nod, recording the judgment in some invisible notebook inside her mind, then returned to her work. And just like that, without either of them announcing it or admitting it, a ritual formed between 2 strangers. 3 o'clock in the morning, the last stool at the bar, 1 draft drink each night adjusted by the smallest degree, more smoke one evening, less sweetness the next, while the question closer or farther away slowly replaced every greeting ordinary people might have used. On the 4th night, when Ronan had finished half his drink, Tessa said while wiping down the counter, in the same even tone she might have used to comment on the weather, The last time a man dressed like you crossed the gaming floor, the whole place held its breath for an hour afterward. One of the dealers misdealt twice in a row. That had never happened before. She folded the cloth and placed it on the counter. And you came back. People who are only passing through don't come back. She didn't ask whether he owned the place, because it wasn't a question. It was a conclusion that had already been tested, and she simply set it between them on the bar, the way she might have set down a drink. Ronan watched her for a long moment. In his world, people either trembled at the knowledge of who he was, fawned over him because of it, or calculated what they might extract from it. This woman knew, and the only thing that changed in her manner was that nothing changed at all. She still charged him for every drink, still returned every cent of his change, still told him to move his elbow when she needed to wipe the part of the counter where he was leaning. That calmness in the presence of full knowledge was something he had no category for. In the nights that followed, he began noticing other things, details that eyes trained to miss nothing, gathered automatically even when he gave no command. He saw the faint, old burns layered across her hands, traces left by thousands of orange peels held over flame, thousands of reaches across boiling steam, the kind of map this profession carved into the flesh of anyone who practiced it long enough and honestly enough. He saw that she always arrived before her shift and left after everyone else. He saw the cheap digital watch on her wrist was set to sound an alarm at 2:00 in the afternoon. And when he asked about it, one of the rare, idle questions he ever allowed himself, she answered simply, "Day shift at the hotel across the boulevard. Housekeeping." Then she added, as though it were the most obvious fact in the world, "No one can live on one shift." She said it without a trace of complaint, without a drop of self-pity, the way someone might explain the law of gravity. And for that very reason, it remained in Ronan's mind longer than any story of hardship he had ever heard. 2 shifts, 16 hours a day, and every night she still had enough strength to stand straight behind this bar, carefully prepare one drink as though performing a ritual, and then pour it away. He didn't ask about that drink again. He had asked once and received the answer that it wasn't for sale, and the predator's instinct inside him understood that some doors only locked more tightly when someone tried to force them open. He could wait. Waiting was something he did well. Then, one afternoon in the middle of the week, inside the conference room on the highest floor, while 2 attorneys presented a waterfront property deal worth as much as an entire city block, Ronan Gallagher suddenly realized that he hadn't heard a word for nearly a full minute. His mind wasn't in that room. It was at an old bar on the ground floor of an abandoned wing, wondering how she would alter the recipe that night, ginger or rosemary, and trying to imagine what expression might cross her face, depending on whether he answered closer or farther away. He recognized what had happened, and he didn't like it. For 12 years, Ronan Gallagher's mind had never wandered, because he had trained it the way a working dog was trained. Wandering meant vulnerability, and vulnerability was paid for with things far more expensive than money. He tapped 2 fingers against the table, and the attorney speaking fell silent at once. "Repeat that last part," Ronan said. The man repeated it. Ronan dealt with the matter in seconds, issued 3 instructions, ended the meeting 20 minutes early, and remained alone in the empty conference room, looking down at the gray city beneath the rain, and asking himself a question he hadn't needed to ask in 12 years. What was happening to him? On the 11th night, Ronan arrived later than usual. The audit had moved into the stage of matching every discrepancy against every individual shift, and he had just spent 2 hours listening to reports about numbers that knew how to hide. So by the time the car stopped at the rear entrance of the Meridian, it was nearly 3:30 in the morning. He took the familiar route through the eastern corridor, pushed open the wooden door of the Empire Room, and found the bar lit but no one standing behind it. The bottle of Irish whiskey had already been set on the counter, and a strip of orange peel had been cut and left waiting, like a sentence abandoned halfway through. Then he remembered something Tessa had once mentioned, that this bar had one other purpose besides serving employees at the end of their shifts, that guests in the private lounge next door sometimes ordered late drinks, and she had to carry them over herself because no servers remained on duty at that hour. He continued toward the light, where the corridor opened onto the edge of the main lounge, and he saw her at the exact moment glass shattered across the floor. Tessa stood at the boundary where the crystal light of the grand hall spilled down around her, the tray tilted sharply to one side, 3 glasses broken beneath her feet into glittering fragments, while her left wrist was trapped inside the hand of a broad, heavy man whose face was flushed dark with alcohol. his expensive shirt hanging crooked and open at 2 buttons. He was the kind of guest every casino recognized. A man who had lost enough money to believe it gave him rights, and drunk enough liquor to believe that everything capable of walking inside the building had been included on his bill. Around them, the late-night crowd slowed and gathered into a silent circle. The curious, cowardly silence of people who had already decided this wasn't their concern. "You spilled my drink," the man said, his voice softened by alcohol but loud enough for the entire corner of the lounge to hear. "Do you know how much the watch on my wrist costs? 10 years of carrying trays for someone like you wouldn't pay for it." He jerked her wrist again, hard enough to send the tray crashing completely to the floor. "I'm calling your manager down here," he continued. "I'll have you fired before this night is over, and then you'll learn how to smile properly at a customer." Tessa didn't pull her hand away. She stood straight, so straight she was almost motionless, her chin slightly raised, her eyes fixed on the man without blinking, and anyone looking only briefly would have said she wasn't afraid. But Ronan never looked briefly. His eyes, trained over 12 years to read people, saw through the surface of that fearlessness and recognized what lay beneath it: a callous. The hardened endurance of someone who had been grabbed that way too many times, had heard words like those too many times, and had learned that resisting would only cost her another job, so all the anger and humiliation had been pressed down behind a still face and a straight spine. People only stood that straight when something inside them had already been forced to bow too many times. Something moved inside Ronan's chest, slow and heavy, like a vast machine beginning to turn after years without power. He crossed the lounge. He didn't hurry and didn't raise his voice, but the crowd parted before him like water before the bow of a ship, and those who recognized his face immediately stepped back even farther. The drunken man didn't recognize him. He was too occupied with enjoying the power he held over the wrist of a woman carrying a tray, so all he saw was the shadow of a dark coat blocking the light. Then the hand gripping Tessa's wrist was removed with a force that couldn't be resisted, and before he could spit out a curse, his whole body was pinned against the glass wall behind him, not painfully, but with the certainty of a sentence already passed, held so firmly that the wall and the hand might have been the 2 jaws of the same vice. The most magnificent casino lounge in Atlantic City fell silent. Slot machines continued to ring in the distance, but in that corner of the room, 100 people stood motionless as figures in a photograph, cards suspended in midair, glasses halted halfway to waiting lips. And in that absolute silence, Ronan Gallagher leaned close to the man's slowly paling face and spoke 6 words in a voice as cold as steel. Not loudly, but each one fell into the frozen room like a stone striking a sheet of ice. "Nobody touches what is mine. Ever." Then he let go. That was all. No punch, no further threat, not even a second glance. The man slid down the glass wall, his legs suddenly remembering what they were made of, and the drunkenness of 10 drinks evaporated from his body in exactly 3 seconds, replaced by the freezing clarity of someone who had just looked into the bottom of an abyss. 2 security officers appeared from opposite sides, as though they had been standing there all along, escorted him toward the exit, and he went with them obediently without looking back once. The crowd broke apart, murmurs returned, and the casino resumed its motion like a river closing over the place where it had swallowed a stone. Tessa bent down to retrieve the tray. Ronan stood there and watched as she gathered every shard of broken glass onto it with neat, composed movements. Then she rose, looked directly at him, and said, "You didn't have to do that." "I know," he replied. Nothing more. No explanation. No claim to gratitude. And for one brief moment, something passed between their eyes. Something without a name. Something that wasn't yet allowed to have one. She turned and walked ahead of him, and he followed her back to the bar inside the Empire Room, where the yellow light was still waiting. She emptied the broken glass into the trash, washed her hands, and said nothing more about what had happened, as though it belonged to another world that had been left behind the wooden door. She took out a glass, warmed the orange peel over the flame, and prepared that night's draft with a touch of vanilla in place of rosemary, then pushed the drink across the counter toward the last stool. "This one's free," she said, and the corner of her mouth lifted in that dry, unmistakably private way of hers. "Don't get used to it." Ronan lifted the glass. Beneath it was a paper coaster, and on the coaster she had quickly written that night's draft recipe in her neat, slanting hand so she wouldn't forget it after he gave his answer, closer or farther away. When he finished drinking, he didn't leave the coaster on the counter. He folded it in half, carefully, as though folding an important document, and slipped it into the inside pocket of his coat on the left, the place closest to his chest. Then he walked out of the Empire room without looking back, because he knew that if he did, he would find her watching him leave, and he still didn't know what to do with that. On Saturday morning, after the night shift ended, Tessa didn't go straight home as she usually did. She crossed the boulevard and pushed open the door of the all-night diner opposite the casino, where employees coming off late shifts and gamblers who had lost every cent sat side by side over cheap coffee and hot plates of eggs, because today was the day Daisy was coming up from Trenton to visit. The girl was already seated at the table beside the window, 19 years old, her hair tied in a ponytail, her student backpack still hanging from one shoulder. And the moment she saw her sister, she sprang to her feet and waved as though they had been apart for 3 years instead of 3 weeks. The sisters embraced, and Daisy began talking without pause about the bus ride, the anatomy exam she had taken the week before, and a roommate who had recently ruined her hair trying to dye it. Tessa sat listening with a rare smile the Empire Room bar had never seen, the unguarded smile of someone beside the most precious thing in her life. The bell above the diner door rang. Ronan walked in wearing a dark coat, alone, and had anyone asked, he would have said he had simply happened to want a cup of coffee after a long night of reviewing reports, even though he hadn't set foot inside a diner once in the past 12 years. And even though Boyd, the only person who knew his schedule, would undoubtedly have maintained a very professional expression if he had heard that explanation. Tessa noticed him immediately, of course. She noticed everything. She didn't look surprised. She only lifted one eyebrow slightly, in a way that said she understood exactly how accidental his presence was, then rose and headed toward the counter to order more food. As she passed him, she said just loudly enough for him to hear, "There's an empty chair at the table by the window, if you're tired of sitting alone." And so, Ronan Gallagher, a man with an entire private floor where he could eat breakfast, found himself lowering into a cracked red vinyl chair inside a diner, sitting across from a 19-year-old nursing student who studied him with open curiosity. "Are you one of my sister's regular customers?" Daisy asked, and without waiting for an answer, continued, "I'm Daisy, Tessa's younger sister. I'm studying nursing in Trenton. Do you work at the casino across the street? You look like one of the people who works over there. The kind who wears a suit, even when it's hot." The girl spoke quickly and laughed often, her questions running into one another without needing space between them. And Ronan, a man who made experienced men weigh every word before speaking, realized he was answering each question seriously, that yes, he worked there, and yes, he was a regular customer at her sister's bar. At the mention of the bar, something lit in Daisy's eyes, a look that was both proud and older than the girl herself. "She makes incredible drinks, doesn't she?" Daisy said. "That's real professional skill. Our father worked the main bar at the Empire Room for 20 straight years, back when it was still the finest place in the whole city." Ronan set down his coffee cup. He didn't ask a question, but the attentive silence he gave her was an invitation. And Daisy, like any younger sister eager to boast about her family, continued without hesitation. "Dad invented a cocktail of his own. It was called the Boardwalk Ember," she said. "Back then, people waited in line until midnight just to drink one. I'm not making that up. Some people drove all the way down from Philadelphia because of it. The casino even printed the drink's name on the menu in real gold lettering." She stirred her hot chocolate, and her voice dropped half a note. "Then they erased it after they fired him." She said it plainly, without bitterness, the way a fact sounds after it has been kept for so long that its sharp edges have worn smooth. Then she shook her head, as though brushing away an invisible fly, and went on. "But that was a long time ago. I was tiny back then, so I don't remember much. I only remember Dad always coming home smelling like burned orange peel. He died 2 years and 3 months ago," she added, with the precision of someone who counts time because time has broken something inside them. Ronan sat perfectly still. Burned orange peel. He thought of the drink prepared each night with the slow care of a ritual, and then poured into the sink. And one piece of the picture slid into place with a sound so faint that only he could hear it. In a low, careful voice, he asked, "What about the drink your sister makes every night and pours away? Do you know why she does it?" Daisy looked at him over the rim of her cup, and for 1 second, the fast-talking, quick-laughing 19-year-old wore the eyes of someone far older than her years. "I don't ask," she replied. "There are some things about her that you don't ask." Then Tessa returned to the table carrying 3 plates of pancakes, and the conversation turned toward exams, dormitory life, and Daisy's stubborn determination to pay for breakfast with her first month's wages from her part-time job at the university library, only for her sister to wave the idea away. Ronan sat between the Monroe sisters, drinking the weakest coffee he had ever tasted, listening to a conversation that didn't contain a single word about money, power, or debt, and felt something deeply unfamiliar, that this cracked vinyl chair was the most comfortable place he had sat in years. But that night, when he returned to his house beside the ocean, he didn't go to bed. He stood at the window looking out over the black water, slowly turning an untouched glass of whiskey in his hand. And when Boyd entered after being summoned, Ronan didn't turn around. "Frank Monroe," he said, "worked the Empire Room bar. Was dismissed about 12 years ago. Died 2 years and 3 months ago. I want to know everything. Who he owed, when the debt began, whose hands it passed through, and where it is now. And I want to know why he was fired." Boyd took out his notebook, his pen moving quickly across the paper. Ronan turned toward him, and something in his gaze made Boyd stop writing halfway through a line. "And Boyd," he said, his voice no louder than a whisper, but heavy as words carved into stone. "No one is to know?" I asked. Boyd brought the report on Sunday evening. Ronan didn't read it in the office on the highest floor of the Meridian, where every one of his coldest decisions had always been signed. He read it at the kitchen table in the house by the ocean, the place where he sometimes sat when he needed to think without the weight of an entire empire pressing down on his shoulders. The file wasn't thick. The truth rarely needed much paper. He poured himself a cup of coffee, sat down, and opened the first page. Frank Monroe, dead at the age of 59. Bartender, 20 years behind the main bar of the Empire Room, described by former co-workers with words people didn't use for ordinary men. Golden hands. A memory that knew the tastes of 300 regular customers. The only man who had ever made a casino night shift smell like home. After losing his job, he had begun the same long descent by which this city had swallowed more men than anyone could count. At first, the gaming tables were only a distraction, then a way to win back what he had lost, then a way to forget. And after that came the high-interest loans from places no bank would ever enter. The original loan was $9,000. Interest fed on interest through winters without work, until the debt had swollen to $14,000. It was sold 3 times, first from a street lender to a collection office that wore the disguise of a legitimate business. Then from that office into a portfolio of small debts gathered the way people collected scrap metal. Ronan turned the page and stopped at one name. The portfolio was now in the hands of Wade Mercer. Wade Mercer, floor manager at the Meridian, one of his men, paid by him, sitting inside his building. Ronan set down his coffee cup very slowly and continued reading the section Boyd had written in the dry language of a man whose loyalty to the truth could become merciless. During the 8 months Wade Mercer had held the portfolio, he had tried 3 times to collect the debt from the only surviving relative of the dead man who still had a job. The first 2 attempts had been made by telephone. Calls the daughter stopped answering after recognizing the unfamiliar number. The third had happened 11 weeks earlier, when Mercer had gone personally to the Empire Room bar at the end of the night shift, stood in front of Tessa Monroe, and spoken a sentence later repeated word for word by a cleaning employee who had happened to overhear it. "Debt doesn't die with the dead." Ronan read the sentence twice. The kitchen was very quiet, filled only by the distant sound of the waves and the clock on the wall counting off each second. But the temperature in the room seemed to fall several degrees. Had Boyd been there, he would have recognized that silence immediately, the kind that 20 years in this work had taught him to fear more than any outburst of rage. 11 weeks earlier. That meant when Ronan had first walked into the Empire Room and found her standing straight behind the bar, making that drink like a ritual, those words had already been resting inside her chest. It meant that every night she handed him a draft and asked whether it was closer or farther away. She was carrying a $14,000 debt left by her dead father, a debt being enforced by the very machinery belonging to the man sitting on the last stool at her bar. She didn't know. He didn't know. Only Wade Mercer knew both ends of that rope. Ronan turned to the next page, the section containing extracted internal data, and his eyes stopped on a detail Boyd had marked with a small note in the margin. Tessa Monroe's payroll record showed a recurring voluntary deduction, once every night, for the cost of 1 cocktail, declared by her and taken directly from her wages for nearly 700 consecutive nights. Beside it was a note from accounting. "Attention recommended. uncontested nightly cocktail charges, possible unauthorized drinking during shift. Ronan stared at those words for a long time. His accounting department saw an alcoholic. He saw a woman working 2 shifts and 16 hours every day, paying out of her own pocket each night to buy herself a few minutes in front of a drink she never consumed. Nearly 700 nights without missing one. He understood, without needing anyone to explain it, that this wasn't the cost of an addiction. It was the cost of a ritual. He didn't allow himself to think any further about what that ritual meant. That was her door, and she would be the one to open it, or it would remain closed forever. He took a drink of coffee that had already gone cold and turned to the final page of the file, the section he had requested separately. The reason Frank Monroe's employment had been terminated 12 years earlier. The page was a copy of an old internal document, the faded archive stamp still visible in the upper left corner, and Ronan began reading with the concentration of a man determined to know who had started the chain of collapse that had destroyed an entire family. He read the first line. He read the second. At the third, the hand holding the page stopped in midair, and for nearly 5 seconds, the man Atlantic City called untouchable didn't move, didn't blink, and didn't breathe out. Then he turned the page face down on the table with a movement so slow and strangely careful that it was as though he were covering something that could break or something that could bite. He sat there without moving for a very long time. The coffee went completely cold. The hand of the clock traveled once around its face. Beyond the window, the night sea continued breathing steadily against the sand, unaware of the things changing inside that silent kitchen. At last, Ronan rose, took the page with him still face down, opened the safe in his study, placed it inside the deepest compartment, locked it, and stood looking at the steel door for a moment, as though he needed to be certain that whatever was inside couldn't crawl back out on its own. Then, he picked up the telephone. Boyd answered after the first ring, because Boyd always answered after the first ring. "Boyd," Ronan said, and his voice was so flat that even he could hear the stillness in it, like a thin sheet of ice covering water too deep to measure. "Arrange a meeting with Wade Mercer. Thursday. Tell him it's about restructuring the portfolio." The restaurant stood on a narrow street 3 blocks from the docks, with no sign, no menu posted outside, only a dark wooden door and a middle-aged man stationed behind it. It was the place the Gallagher family had always used for conversations that required good food, private rooms, and employees who understood the value of hearing nothing. Wade Mercer arrived 4 minutes late. He entered the private room with the stride of a man summoned by his superior to discuss business, confident and at ease, his gold ring tapping lightly against the back of the chair as he pulled it out, and he sat across from Ronan wearing a smile that was just familiar enough. "You called me in about the restructuring," he said. "I brought the figures for this quarter's portfolio, if you'd like to review them." Ronan didn't answer immediately. A file lay in front of him, and he opened it without hurry, turning the first page, then another, at the pace of a man who possessed all the time in the world, while Wade waited, and no one had yet poured water into the glass before him. "The portfolio of small individual debts you acquired 8 months ago," Ronan said, his eyes still on the page. "I'm reviewing one account in it, the Monroe account." Wade's smile faltered for half a beat, no longer than that, but inside this room, half a beat was a very long time. "Ah," he said, "the old bartender's account. The original debt was $9,000. With interest, it's 14 now. The debtor is dead, but his family can still work, so I'm handling it according to procedure." Ronan turned another page. "Procedure," he repeated, as though testing the weight of the word. "Tell me about the 3rd collection attempt." The room grew quieter. Wade shifted in his chair. "Which 3rd attempt, sir?" Ronan looked up for the first time since Wade had entered, and those gray eyes settled on the man across from him without anger, without threat, simply settled there, the way someone might place a heavy object on a tree branch to discover where it would break. 11 weeks ago, Ronan said, "you entered my casino, crossed my gaming floor, stood in front of my employee, an orphaned young woman working 2 shifts a day, and told her that debt doesn't die with the dead." Every word fell evenly and without emphasis, and for that very reason, the sentence carried the weight of a stone slab. Sweat began to gather at Wade's temples. He opened his mouth. "Sir, I was only collecting a legitimate debt. The amount is in the books. I have the right." "You have the right to collect debts," Ronan interrupted, his voice no louder than before. "Out there. According to the rules of out there." You don't have the right to bring that business inside my building, stand on my floor, and speak those words to one of my people." He closed the file and placed both hands over it. "Now listen carefully, because I'm only going to say this once. The Monroe account is closed. All $14,000, principal and the interest you people fattened over the years, will be paid in full into the portfolio from my private funds. No invoice, no receipt, no written record of any kind. As of today, it never existed." Wade blinked. "Sir, that's $14,000 belonging to the portfolio. I can't, simply." "You don't have to do anything," Ronan said. "The money will be in the portfolio account before noon tomorrow. The only thing you have to do is forget. Forget the Monroe name, forget the address, forget the telephone number, forget the way to the Empire Room. No one in your network, not one collector, not one messenger, not one shadow connected to you in any way, is to go near Tessa Monroe, call her, look at her, or know that she exists." Wade swallowed, and for 1 second, greed or pride rose above his fear. "Sir, with all due respect, in 15 years you've never interfered with a minor account. If the other portfolio holders hear about this, people will ask why. People will think." Wade. Just one word, his own name, spoken so softly it was almost gentle, and it cut through his sentence like a blade through thread. Ronan leaned forward slightly, only a few inches, just enough to change the nature of the distance between them. "You're sitting in my restaurant, spending the salary I pay you, and the next thing you intend to say concerns what other people will think of me." He paused. "Are you certain you want to finish that sentence?" The room was so quiet they could hear the ice melting in the pitcher. Wade Mercer looked into the gray eyes across the table, and whatever he had intended to say died before reaching his mouth. "No, sir," he said. "Good," Ronan replied, rising and fastening the button of his coat. "Eat. The food here is excellent." He placed a large bill on the table for a check no one had yet brought, and left the room without looking back. Wade Mercer remained alone inside the private room, sitting before a table where no food had been served. He stayed there for a very long time, and the strange thing was that he wasn't thinking about the $14,000 that had just vanished from his control. 14,000 was money, and money could be earned again. He was thinking about the audit that had been moving through the floors of the Meridian for the past 2 weeks, about the shift comparisons tightening one circle after another around the numbers he had scattered thinly and hidden with care, and about how sooner or later those circles would close around his name. And he was thinking about something else, something that had just happened inside that room. In 15 years working beneath the Gallagher family, he had watched Ronan sever million-dollar business ties with a single nod. He had watched him sit as still as stone through negotiations that left sweat running down other men's backs. And not once, not a single time, had he seen that man personally interfere with a minor debt. No account below 6 figures had ever made Ronan Gallagher pick up a telephone, much less arrange a private meal. Yet today, because of a waitress and $14,000, he had sat in this room for 20 minutes. A weakness. For the first time in 15 years, Wade Mercer had just seen a weakness in the untouchable man, and the instinct of someone who survived by collecting leverage immediately caught the scent of the most valuable commodity in the world. He took out his telephone, dialed a number that wasn't saved under any name, and when the person on the other end answered, his voice had regained the calm of a gambler who had just glimpsed the wager of his life. "Pull every old personnel file from the Empire Room," he said. "The older the better, from the years when it was still open. And everything on a woman named Tessa Monroe, quietly, leave no trace." The money was transferred into the portfolio before noon the following day, as quietly as rain passing through the night, and Tessa Monroe had no idea that the $14,000 stone pressing against her chest every time she woke at 3 o'clock in the afternoon had vanished during the span of a meal. No one touched. She still arrived at the bar on time, still worked 2 shifts, still counted every last cent of change she returned to customers, because no one had told her, and the man who could have told her had chosen silence, not so he could claim credit later, but because he still hadn't found a way to give something to a woman who had never asked anyone for anything. Meanwhile, the nights inside the Empire Room continued gathering, one layer over another, like sediment. Ronan began arriving earlier, first at 2:45, then at 2:30, and staying longer, until the last employees finishing their shifts had gone home, and the entire wing held only the 2 of them beneath a pool of yellow light. He continued offering excuses, and she continued, refusing to let those excuses pass unchallenged. One night, just as he settled onto the last stool at the bar, she placed the latest draft in front of him and said in a dry, level voice, "Let me guess. You have another meeting at 4 o'clock in the morning." He looked at her. "Yesterday it was a meeting at 3:30. She continued, still polishing a glass that didn't need polishing. "The day before that, it was 3:15. Your schedule moves around quite a lot, Mr. Owner." She spoke those last two words in a tone that stripped them of their title and turned them into a private joke only the two of them understood, and Ronan Gallagher, who hadn't allowed anyone to tease him in 12 years, felt the corner of his mouth lift without asking his permission. Their conversations remained brief and sharp, blades crossing above the wooden counter. But between those exchanges there began to appear stretches of silence that needed no filling, the kind of silence only people who had stopped guarding themselves against one another were willing to share. Then came a night both of them would remember afterward. A hard wind was rising beyond the boulevard. The casino was quieter than usual, and Tessa prepared her ritual drink earlier than she normally did. Ronan sat there in silence, watching her stand before the unfinished glass, and for the first time since that first night, she didn't pour it away immediately. She looked at it longer than usual, then spoke without looking at him, her voice as even as though she were repeating something she had told herself 1,000 times. "Everyone thinks I can't make this drink because I'm missing the recipe. Daisy probably thinks that too." She tilted the glass, and the amber liquor poured into the sink. Only after setting the empty glass down did she finish the thought. "That isn't it. I'm afraid of getting it right, because if it's finished, then it means my father really isn't coming back to taste it." When she was done speaking, she picked up a towel and wiped her hands, neat and decisive, as though she had just finished reading an item from an inventory list, and that neatness made the words 10 times heavier than tears. Ronan said nothing. He understood the value of saying nothing at the right moment. He simply remained there, his presence steady and silent as a wall against the wind, and that was the only answer he had to give. A long time later, once she had returned to the glasses and the breathing of the room had settled back into its usual rhythm, Tessa looked at him through the pool of light and asked a question she had kept for weeks. "I've noticed you never sit anywhere except that stool. Back to the wall, face toward the door, even when this whole room is empty. Occupational habit." Ronan lifted the draft, turned it slightly in his hand, and watched the liquid catch the yellow light. For one moment, the steel door inside that man opened by the narrowest crack. "My younger brother didn't," he said. "Once. That was all. 4 words. Then one. And the door closed again. But the crack had been wide enough for Tessa to see that behind it there wasn't an empire, only a dark room with an empty chair. She didn't ask anything more. Better than anyone, she understood that some doors only locked more tightly when pushed. She simply reached for the pot of hot coffee and filled his cup, even though he hadn't finished it. A small and unnecessary gesture. And because it was unnecessary, it became the perfect comfort. They said nothing else that night before he left, and each of them carried away a piece of the other they hadn't possessed before. Then came a night somewhere in the 20s. He had stopped counting, when Tessa tried a new draft using 1 drop of cold-pressed orange oil instead of the slice of ginger. She finished it and, from habit, tasted a small spoonful before serving it. Then she went completely still. The spoon stopped in midair. Her brown eyes, always so direct and alert, widened slightly as she stared down at the drink as though a ghost had just entered through the door. And for 3 full seconds, the woman whose hand had never trembled before anything stood frozen behind her father's bar. Ronan saw every detail. He saw the color shift around her eyes, saw her throat move once as she swallowed, saw her fingers tighten around the spoon's handle. "It's very close now, isn't it?" he asked softly. Tessa lowered the spoon with great care, then pushed the glass across the bar toward him, and when she spoke, her voice was level again. Perfectly level. Deliberately level. "Farther away," she said. "Tonight it's farther away." Ronan lifted the glass and tasted it, and the cool orange dissolved across the tip of his tongue with a scorched sweetness that almost ached, closer to the ritual drink than any draft he had ever tasted. He looked at the woman turning her back to place the bottle on the shelf, her shoulders as straight as ever, and for the first time since he had known her, Ronan Gallagher was certain of one thing. Tessa Monroe had just lied to him, and the lie wasn't meant for him. It was meant for her own fear, the fear that she was almost reaching the end of a journey she wasn't ready to let end. That morning, after the night shift had ended, and the Empire room held only Tessa as she inventoried the last bottles. A stranger appeared at the end of the bar. He wasn't an employee. She knew the face of every night shift worker in the entire building. He wasn't a lost private guest either. Private guests never moved that quietly. He was of average height, wearing a featureless gray coat, with the kind of face people were born to forget the moment they looked away, and he stood there with the practiced stillness of a man whose profession required him to appear in places where he hadn't been invited. "We're not open yet," Tessa said without stopping her count. "And if you're looking for the casino, go back the way you came and turn left." "I'm not here for a drink," he said. He reached inside his coat, took out a yellow-brown document envelope, moderately thick and bearing no sender's name, then placed it on the wooden counter and pushed it toward her with 2 fingers. "Mr. Mercer sends his regards," he said. "He thinks you should know who the man sitting on that last stool every night really is before you get in any deeper." Tessa's hand stopped over the bottles. She looked at the envelope resting on the counter, and the name Mercer dropped into her chest like a cold coin striking the bottom of a well. The name she had heard through calls from unfamiliar numbers. The name tied to the sentence she had never told anyone, not even Daisy, the sentence that still woke beside her on her worst afternoons. Then she raised her eyes and looked directly into that forgettable face with brown eyes that didn't blink. Instead of picking up the envelope, she placed one hand on it and pushed it firmly back toward him across the full width of the counter. "I don't accept things from strangers at 5 o'clock in the morning," she said, her voice even, every word clear. "And if there's anything about him I need to know, I'll hear it from him, not from an envelope sent by the man who once stood exactly where you're standing and spoke to me about a dead man's debt." She withdrew her hand and picked up the bottle she had been counting. "Now get out of my bar." The man remained still for 2 seconds, clearly recalculating a scene that hadn't unfolded as expected, then picked up the envelope and returned it to his coat. "You should know what you're playing with," he said, and this time there was something in his voice that almost sounded like genuine advice. "Noted," Tessa replied without looking up. "Go." He left. The wooden door closed behind him, and Tessa Monroe stood alone in the bar, still holding the bottle, and remained that way for exactly 30 seconds without moving. Then she placed the bottle on the shelf, wrote the final number in the inventory book, wiped the part of the counter where the envelope had rested, and closed the bar at the usual time, because she had learned long ago that when the ground began to shake, the first thing to do was plant your feet. Trembling could be saved for later, but throughout that day, as she cleaned row after row of hotel rooms, the name Mercer and the last stool kept circling each other in her mind like 2 cards lying face down. That night, when Ronan entered the Empire room at 2:45 and took his usual seat, she didn't begin making the draft as she normally did. She stood opposite him with both hands resting on the counter and asked directly, "A stranger came here this morning. He brought greetings from someone named Mercer, and an envelope that was supposed to tell me who you really are. I sent him away and returned the envelope unopened." She looked straight into his eyes. "Now I want to hear it from you." The room fell silent. Ronan looked at the woman standing before him, and he understood that this was one of those moments from which every road afterward would divide, that a lie now might purchase a few weeks of peace and cost him everything of value later. "You've already guessed some of it," he said. "Since the 2nd week," she replied. "An entire gaming floor doesn't hold its breath for a regular customer." "Then you know who I am," he said. "My name stands behind this building, and behind many other things in this city. Some of them are clean. Some are things no one would ever call clean. I won't give you the details, not because I'm trying to hide them from you, but because the fewer of those details you know, the safer you'll be." He allowed the words to remain between them for a moment, before continuing. "Mercer is one of my men. He was one of my men. He controls a portfolio of small debts, and inside that portfolio was an account bearing your father's name." Tessa didn't move. 14,000, she said softly, not as a question. "It used to be 14,000, Ronan said. "The account is closed, completely erased. 3 weeks ago. It no longer exists, and no one is permitted to mention it or come near you because of it again." Tessa's hands tightened slightly against the counter. She had lived with that number for so long it had become part of her breathing, and now this man was telling her it had been gone for 3 weeks, as casually as if he were speaking about the weather. "Erased," she repeated, and it took another second before her voice became steady again. "Why? Because that number should never have been allowed to reach you, Ronan said, and for the first time that night, something moved beneath the flatness of his voice. And because I wanted it gone. They looked at each other across the wooden counter, and everything they hadn't spoken was present between them. Then Tessa asked the next question, because she was someone who always looked directly at the hardest part of any truth. Wade Mercer is going to be trouble, isn't he? He didn't send that envelope here because he wanted to help me. I'm dealing with it, Ronan said. That isn't an answer, she replied. It's the only answer I have right now, he said, and there was something rare in his voice, something almost like an apology from a man unfamiliar with the shape of one. I didn't think he would dare touch you. That was my mistake, and it won't happen again. Tessa watched him for a long while, then gave one slow nod and reached for the bottle of Irish whiskey, beginning that night's draft. Because every night required a draft. Even this one, especially this one. All right, she said as she held the orange peel over the flame. Ronan looked at her. All right, he repeated, as though he needed to make certain he had heard correctly. She placed the drink in front of him and lifted her brown eyes to meet his. I didn't say I'm not afraid, she said. I said all right. Those are two different things. They didn't speak of Mercer again that night, and when Ronan finished his drink, paid, accepted the exact change, and walked out of the pool of yellow light as he did every night, Tessa remained behind the bar watching the dark shape of his coat for longer than usual. Much longer, because she hadn't only heard what he had said. She had also heard everything he hadn't said, and somewhere beneath all the rare honesty of that night, she sensed, with the instinct that had kept her alive through so many years, that the man was still withholding something heavier than everything he had just admitted, and it stood between them like a shadow without a name. 3 nights later, inside an apartment overlooking the marina, Wade Mercer sat before a stack of yellowed documents that his forgettable messenger had spent 4 days dragging out of the old personnel archives. He turned through the pages with the patience of a gambler counting cards, employment records, payroll sheets, leave requests belonging to people who had left the Empire Room more than a decade earlier, names that meant nothing, until he reached a thin file clipped separately from the rest, a surviving record of the personnel purge conducted when that wing had been closed 12 years before. A list of employees whose contracts had been terminated, among them the name Frank Monroe, and at the bottom of the dismissal order, in the space reserved for the approval signature of the highest authority, Wade's hand stopped in the middle of turning the page. He leaned closer, read the signature once, then read it again beneath the desk lamp, and over the course of several seconds, the calculating face of a man who had survived 15 years by finding leverage on others shifted from disbelief into something almost resembling religious joy. He leaned back in his chair and stared at the page beneath the pool of light as though it were a winning lottery ticket, then smiled, the small, private, dangerous smile of someone who had just discovered a weapon even its owner didn't know existed. The meeting was arranged for the following afternoon at a restaurant on the northern edge of the city, territory where Gallagher men rarely ventured, and the man sitting across from Wade at a corner table was in his 40s, broad-shouldered, with closely cut salt and pepper hair, and a heavy watch on his wrist. Farrell Doyle, a distant nephew of the aging northern boss, chief of collections for the entire family, a man everyone in the city's underworld knew was growing tired of waiting for a seat higher than the one he had been permitted to occupy. I hear you have something to sell, Farrell said, wasting no time on greetings. Wade placed a thick, familiar yellow-brown envelope on the table. 3 things in one, he said. First, a name. The woman working the Empire Room bar on the night shift, and everything I know about her. Second, Ronan Gallagher's habits, his hours, his private route, the stool he has occupied every night for more than a month, the kind of information no one has managed to sell you in 15 years because, for 15 years, he had no habits worth selling. Farrell looked at him, and something in his eyes began to change. And third, Wade continued, lowering his voice and pushing the envelope forward by the width of one finger. A document that could blow everything apart. I'm not telling you what it is. I'm only telling you that if that woman sees it, whatever Gallagher has been building every night at that bar will collapse faster than it was raised, and a man who has just lost what matters most to him is a man who makes mistakes. You people have been waiting years for him to make one. The dining room around them remained noisy, but at the corner table, the silence lasted long enough for Wade to know the sale had been made. How much? Farrell asked. 20,000, Wade replied. Cash, and a place with your side when the wind changes, because I don't intend to be inside the Meridian when this explodes. Farrell Doyle studied the envelope for another second, then gave a quiet laugh and shook his hand. That same afternoon, 60 miles away in a dormitory room in Trenton, Daisy Monroe had her phone clipped into a stand while both hands struggled with a cheap coffee dripper. On the screen, Tessa was laughing as she gave instructions. Slowly. The water should be very hot, not boiling violently. You rush everything, so of course the coffee turns bitter. Daisy argued that it was the dormitory kettle's fault, not hers, and then both sisters burst into laughter when the coffee overflowed into the tray, their clear laughter traveling across 60 miles of signal. The 19-year-old girl went to sleep peacefully that night inside her small, safe room, never knowing that her sister's name had just been placed on a scale at the northern edge of the city. During that same week, the audit at the Meridian closed its final circle. On Friday morning, Boyd placed the completed findings on Ronan's desk. Every discrepancy had been cross-checked against individual shifts, employee codes, and time periods, and every arrow converged on a single name: Wade Mercer, the man who had been draining gaming floor revenue for 3 months through cuts as thin as razor blades. Ronan read the findings without changing expression and said only, "Don't touch him yet. I want to know what else he's hiding. Follow every step he takes." And so, the following night, while Ronan sat on the last stool at the Empire Room bar with only half of the latest draft gone, Boyd entered, something that had never happened during all the nights before, because Boyd understood that the pool of yellow light was private territory not to be invaded, and his appearance at the doorway was itself an alarm. He walked over, bent close to Ronan's shoulder, and spoke softly enough for only one person to hear. "Sir, word from the north. Doyle's people are asking questions, and they're asking specifically about the woman at the Empire Room." Ronan didn't turn his head. He remained still for one beat, then set his glass on the counter with 1/3 still remaining, and never lifted it again. For the first time since that first night, a draft was left unfinished. Tessa saw it from the other end of the bar. She saw everything. The way his posture straightened by the smallest degree, the shift in the weight of his shoulders, the half-finished glass abandoned on the counter, and she didn't ask, because she understood that some questions only added weight to the shoulders of the person forced to answer them. Ronan rose, fastened his coat, placed money on the counter, and headed toward the door with Boyd, his steps still measured but half a beat quicker than usual. When the dark shape of his coat was about to disappear beyond the wooden doorway, Tessa's voice came from behind him, not loud, but clear, inside the empty room. "Ronan." He stopped. It was the first time she had called him by his name. Not Mr. Owner in that teasing voice, not simply you, but his name. 2 syllables placed carefully between them, like a full glass set down on a counter. He turned halfway around, and she stood behind the bar with the towel still held in both hands, looking at him with brown eyes that were direct and clear. "Be careful," she said. Nothing more. Ronan Gallagher stood there for another second. Over 12 years, people had said every kind of thing to him. They had asked him, reported to him, sworn to him, begged him, pleaded with him, but no one, not one person, had ever told him to be careful, because the entire city assumed he was the thing everyone else needed to be careful of. He looked at the small woman standing inside that pool of yellow light, gave one quiet nod, then stepped out into the darkness. And throughout the drive across the sleeping city, those 2 words remained inside his chest, warm and heavy, like someone's hand resting over the exact place where his heart was. The news arrived at 11 o'clock the following night, through a source the Gallagher family had cultivated inside Northern Territory for years, and it was brief enough to chill the blood. Farrell Doyle had hired a man named Sal Pruitt, a freelance operator who specialized in jobs the families didn't want staining their own sleeves, to enter the Empire Room within the next night or two and deliver a message. In the language of that world, no one needed an explanation of what it meant to deliver a message through a woman standing behind a bar. The more important detail appeared in the final line of the report. Farrell was acting alone, without taking the matter to the old boss, making a private wager in the hope of earning a great victory before asking for a higher seat. Ronan read the report twice, stood beside the window of his oceanfront house for exactly 1 minute longer, placed his anger in one compartment and his plan in another, then picked up the telephone and dialed a number he had known by heart for a long time, but had never called. The phone rang 3 times before Tessa answered, her voice alert and free of sleep, the voice of someone who lived by night shifts and, perhaps, of someone who had been waiting for a call like this ever since the words "be careful" had left her mouth. "Ronan," she said, not as a question. "I need you to listen to me," he said, "and don't interrupt until I'm finished." A brief silence came from the other end. "An opening like that usually means nothing good," she said. "Go ahead, I'm listening." "Don't come to the bar tomorrow night," Ronan said. "Take one shift off. Just one. Don't go to the casino or anywhere near it. Stay home, lock the door, and keep your phone with you." Silence filled the line, and across 6 miles of invisible signal, Ronan could almost feel the way that woman was thinking, not panicking, not agreeing obediently, but weighing each fact the way she measured every amount of liquor in a recipe. "Tell me why," she said. "Someone intends to come to your bar," Ronan replied without evasion, because he had learned that with this woman, the truth traveling in a straight line always arrived faster than any detour. "It isn't because of you. It's because of me. There are people who want to send me a message, and they've chosen to send it through you." Another silence followed, longer this time, and when Tessa spoke again, her voice didn't tremble. It was only slower, as though she were placing each word on the counter so she could see it clearly. "Because I matter to you." It wasn't a question, and both of them knew it. Ronan stood inside his dark room, looking out over a moonless black sea, and in that moment he understood that some words, once spoken, could never be taken back. They would remain forever between two people as witnesses. "Yes," he said. One word. On the other end, he heard her breathe out very softly, and when she continued, her voice carried weariness, and something warmer than weariness. "All right, I'll stay home tomorrow night. One night. But Ronan, listen carefully. I have a younger sister studying in Trenton. I have 2 jobs that pay the rent. I have a life. It's small, but it's mine, and I've spent 10 years keeping it on its feet. I can't hide inside my home forever, and I won't live looking over my shoulder every time I walk down the street. So do whatever you have to do, but finish it. Truly finish it." "I promise," Ronan said. "I know you do," she replied. "That's why I agreed." Then she ended the call first, because that was who Tessa Monroe was, and Ronan remained there holding the silent telephone for another moment, realizing that the corner of his mouth had once again lifted without permission. The following night, the Empire Room was dark. Every light behind the bar had been switched off, the bottles were locked inside their cabinets, and the entire wing had returned to the same abandoned darkness it had carried for 12 years. With one difference, no one looking in from outside could have known. A man sat on the last stool at the bar, his dark coat blending into the shadows, as still as part of the woodwork, while in 2 concealed corners of the room, 2 of Boyd's men stood so motionless that even the spiders on the ceiling saw no reason to pause their work. They had been waiting since midnight. At 1:45, the wooden door gave a short, faint creak. Sal Pruitt slipped inside, compact in build, his footsteps quiet. One hand held inside his coat pocket. He made it 5 steps toward the bar before stopping, because his eyes, slowly adjusting to the darkness, had recognized that the shape at the end of the counter wasn't a chair. The shape spoke, its voice calm and soft, as though they were continuing a conversation left unfinished. "She isn't here tonight, Sal. It's only me." Sal Pruitt froze in the middle of the room. He had been doing this work long enough to recognize that voice, even though he had never heard it before. In the entire underworld of the city, there was only one man whose calm sounded more frightening than the chambering of a round, and at the same moment, 2 shadows separated just far enough from the walls for him to count the numbers. The calculation inside Sal Pruitt's mind took half a second. On one side was Farrell Doyle's payment. On the other was this dark room. The man sitting comfortably on the last stool as though he had been waiting there since another lifetime. And the naked truth that the man sent to deliver a message had discovered that the intended recipient was waiting to receive him in person. Sal slowly removed his hand from his pocket and showed that it was empty. "I don't want trouble," he said. "Good," Ronan replied. "Then call Farrell, right now, from here. Tell him you inspected the job, that it isn't clean, and that you're withdrawing. No negotiation, no further explanation, and no second call." Sal looked toward the last stool for another 2 seconds, then took out his telephone and dialed. Inside the perfectly silent room, the other 3 men heard every word he spoke. "Farrell, it's me, the Empire Room job. I'm out. The ground isn't clean. I'm not taking it. I'll return the deposit tomorrow morning. A furious roar erupted from the other end. Sal added only one sentence. You aren't paying me enough to die. Then he ended the call. He looked toward Ronan, gave the professional nod of one man in the trade acknowledging another, and left through the same door he had entered, moving faster than when he arrived. The darkness closed behind him. One of the men in the corner switched on the small light behind the bar, and the familiar pool of yellow light returned as though nothing had happened. Boyd entered from the corridor, where he had held position since midnight. He walked to the last stool, and the expression on his face prevented Ronan, who had just neutralized a threat without throwing a single punch, from feeling even 1 second of relief. Sir, Boyd said in a low voice, there's something else. Our source in the north has confirmed more information. The package Wade sold to the Doyle family didn't contain only her name and your habits. He sold them something else as well. Ronan looked at him. What? Boyd slowly shook his head. We don't know yet. We only know Farrell paid a separate amount specifically for it, and he kept it for himself instead of placing it in the family's shared archive. Beneath the yellow light of the Empire Room bar, Ronan Gallagher sat perfectly still, and a feeling he hadn't known in 12 years crawled along his spine. The feeling of a chess player who had just discovered there was a piece on the board he couldn't see. At 7 o'clock the following morning, Ronan made a move the entire underworld of the city would have discussed for years had they ever learned of it. He didn't call Farrell, and he didn't send a response through intermediaries, as the unwritten rules required. He called straight to the top, dialing the private number of Emmett Doyle, the 72-year-old boss of the entire Northern family, a man Ronan had met face-to-face only twice in more than a decade, both times on occasions when each side had brought lawyers. Going over someone's head carried a price. It broke protocol, admitted the seriousness of the situation, and required the caller to surrender something in exchange for the privilege. Ronan knew all of that when he dialed, and he dialed anyway. The telephone rang twice before someone answered, and the voice on the other end was deep and slow, roughened by age and by a lifetime of speaking only when necessary. Ronan Gallagher, the old man said, needing no introduction. I've been wondering when you would call. Then you already know what happened last night, Ronan said. Tell me your version, the old man replied, and Ronan did, briefly and completely, adding nothing and leaving nothing out, from the Doyle men asking questions about Tessa Monroe by name, to Sal Pruitt entering the Empire Room at 1:45 in the morning, to the call of withdrawal Ronan had heard with his own ears. A long silence followed after he finished, the silence of an old man rearranging pieces in his mind. Then Emmett Doyle spoke, and there was a weariness in his voice he made no effort to conceal. Farrell's ambition is larger than his intelligence. I've known that for 2 years, and kept delaying what needed to be done, because he's blood. He acted without my order, without my permission, and without the smallest measure of wisdom his position requires. Your call this morning hasn't told me anything new about my nephew, Gallagher. It has only helped me decide when to deal with him. Then what remains between us? Ronan asked. The price, the old man replied, direct and without evasion, because peace had never been free in this city. You went over his head. You need a guarantee from my own mouth, and I'll give it to you. That woman is removed from every calculation, permanently. You have my personal word. In return, the sports betting rights in the Dock District next season, the business your family has always received directly, I want it open to fair bidding. Whoever is strongest wins. Ronan stood beside the window of his office on the highest floor, looking down at the gray docks beneath the morning mist, and completed the calculation in 2 seconds. Those rights were worth an entire season's profit, and they weren't worth 1/10 of the name that had just been spoken. Done, he said. The old man gave a quiet laugh on the other end, dry as dead leaves. You paid that price quickly. Either you're richer than I thought, or that girl is worth more than I thought. Ronan didn't answer, and his silence was the clearest answer of all. Before ending the call, Emmett Doyle added one more thing, his voice slowing, and for a moment he no longer sounded like a crime boss, but like an old man sitting alone inside a house far too large for him. Hold on to that girl, Gallagher. I once had someone who told me to be careful every night before I walked out the door. I traded her for 3 city blocks. Now I own 30 city blocks, and there's no one left to tell me anything. The line went dead. Ronan remained there holding the telephone for a while, and the words "be careful" from the previous night settled once more inside his chest. He understood that the old man had just given him something more valuable than any guarantee. The rest of that day unfolded with the cold precision of surgery. Wade Mercer was summoned to the highest floor at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and when he entered, 2 files were already waiting on the desk. One contained the final audit report, with every arrow converging on his name. The other listed everything he had sold to the Doyle family. No one raised his voice. Ronan spoke for only 4 minutes. The debt portfolio was being taken from him. Every form of access had been revoked as of noon. The evidence of his theft from the gaming floor wouldn't be given to anyone. It would remain in a safe, like an insurance policy. And for as long as Wade stayed far from the city and remained silent, that policy would continue sleeping undisturbed. A car was waiting in the underground garage, along with a one-way ticket and enough money to begin again somewhere no one knew his name. That was the full extent of the mercy the Gallagher empire still offered a man who had stolen from it and sold it. Wade listened to everything, his face turning gray by degrees, signed what needed to be signed, and walked between 2 escorts toward the garage like a man who had aged 10 years in a single afternoon. But after he had taken his seat in the back and the car door was about to close, he turned to look at Boyd standing beside the vehicle, and a smile appeared on that gray face, the small, private, dangerous smile Boyd would remember for a very long time. "Tell your boss," Wade said through the narrowing gap as the window rose. "He's too late. The package was sent yesterday." The car pulled away, merged into the flow of traffic along the boulevard, and disappeared. Boyd repeated the words exactly 10 minutes later, and Ronan remained silent behind his desk for a very long time. He knew what the package contained, or almost knew, because inside the safe at his oceanfront house there was a page lying face down, and copies of pages like that were never limited to one. He knew he had to tell Tessa. He had to tell her himself before anyone else spoke in his place. He had known that since the night he sat motionless at the kitchen table, and he decided he would do it tomorrow. Tomorrow, when the old Northern boss's guarantee had traveled through every level beneath him, when Farrell had been dealt with by his own uncle, when every threat surrounding her had been cleared away, when everything was safe, Ronan would sit on the last stool at the bar and tell her all of it, in his own words. He had one more night to find those words. Words he had never once needed to rehearse in his entire life. It was Ronan Gallagher's oldest habit, remaining silent to protect someone, dealing with everything first, and only then opening his mouth. In 12 years, that habit had never betrayed him. He had no way of knowing that this time, it had made him exactly 1 day too late. Tessa arrived earlier than usual that night, because after taking a shift off, there were always unfinished tasks waiting behind the bar, and she walked through the familiar employee corridor with a ring of keys in one hand, her mind occupied with whether she needed to order more smoked honey before the weekend. She stopped in front of the row of old employee lockers placed against the wall outside the sealed area, where she still kept her coat and purse every night, and the hand lifting her key froze in midair. Taped neatly to the gray painted metal door of her locker was a yellow-brown envelope, the kind used for documents, moderately thick and bearing no sender's name, and she recognized it immediately because she had once pushed that exact envelope back across the wooden counter at 5 o'clock in the morning. Beneath it, someone had attached a small slip of paper containing only one line in plain block letters. Ask him who signed it. The corridor was empty. Tessa stood before her locker for a long time, longer than she wanted to admit. And during those moments, a brief war unfolded inside the woman who had made a habit of returning everything she had never asked to receive. She had refused this envelope once, with all the pride she possessed, and she had told the man who sat on the last stool that if there was anything she needed to know, she would hear it from him. She had given him that opportunity, for weeks, and the unspoken thing she had sensed remained between them like a shadow without a name. Ask him who signed it. Signed what? She removed the envelope, and this time, she opened it. There was only one sheet of paper inside, a copy of an old internal document with a faded archive stamp still visible in the upper left corner, its title written in the dry language of administration. Employee termination order under restructuring, Empire Room Wing, followed by a list of names. Her eyes traveled down the page and stopped at the 9th line. Frank Monroe, bartender, 20 years of service. She had always known that order existed, the way people know an old wound exists without needing to see the record of it. This was the document that had taken away her father's job, taken away the smell of burned orange peel from his coat every night, opened the door beyond which waited the gaming tables, the loans, the telephone calls, and finally an afternoon, when she had stood in a hospital corridor and received the news. She already knew all of that. What she had never known was at the bottom of the page, in the space reserved for the approval signature of the highest authority, a signature sharp, neat, and decisive, and beneath it, a clearly printed name that couldn't be mistaken for anyone else. Ronan Gallagher. The world didn't collapse. That was the strangest part. The corridor remained silent. The light remained yellow and dim. The ring of keys remained in her hand. Only something very deep inside Tessa Monroe quietly began to freeze, layer after layer, like the surface of a lake on a windless night. She folded the paper along its original creases, returned it to the envelope, and walked toward the bar with steps that were perfectly even. Ronan was already there. He had arrived early and was sitting on the last stool, and that night he had a reason for coming early. He had found the words he intended to say. He had rehearsed them throughout the day, and when he saw her enter the pool of light, he rose, something he had never done before, because he meant to begin the conversation properly. Then he saw the envelope in her hand. Tessa placed it on the wooden counter between them, exactly where the draft was set down every night. She took out the page, unfolded it, and turned it neatly toward him, all with movements so calm they were frightening. "Is this real?" she asked. Her voice didn't tremble. That was what Ronan would remember forever about that moment. Her voice didn't tremble at all. It was flat and clear as the wooden counter between them. He looked down at the page, at his own signature at the bottom, the signature of a 22-year-old boy he had left behind long ago, then raised his eyes and looked directly into the waiting brown ones. He didn't deny it, because among all the things he had never been a man who denied what he had done. "It's real," he said. "I signed it during my first week in this position. I was 22. It was 1 week after my brother's funeral. They placed a stack of restructuring papers in front of me and said the empire had to become leaner if it was going to survive. I signed 30 documents that morning. I didn't read every name. The silence after those words was long and deep. Tessa looked at him and asked the second question, the only one that still mattered. "How long have you known?" Ronan could have lied. A lie at that moment would have been cheap and easy. And all his life he had watched other people choose cheap and easy lies. 3 weeks, he said. "Since I received the report about your father." The last page. The air beneath the yellow light seemed to thicken. 3 weeks, she repeated, no louder than a breath. "For 3 weeks, every night, you sat on that stool, drank what I made, asked whether it was closer or farther away, and listened while I told you what I was afraid of." She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. She didn't shout, didn't throw the paper, didn't ask why. And it was the absence of all those things that made the room grow colder 1 degree at a time. Instead, she did something simple, slow, and more frightening than any scream. She reached behind her back, untied the black apron she had worn through nearly 2 years behind that bar, folded it into 4 even sections, smooth and careful as though folding a flag, and placed it on the wooden counter beside the page bearing his signature. "I can't forgive this," she said. And now, only now, a hairline fracture passed through her voice. "Not because of the signature, Ronan. A 22-year-old boy who had just buried his brother signed 30 papers in 1 morning. I can understand that. I've lived long enough to understand that." She looked directly into his eyes one final time. "It's the 3 weeks of silence." Then Tessa Monroe picked up her purse, walked around the end of the bar, and passed the most powerful man in Atlantic City, as though passing a stranger in a train station. The scent of burned orange peel, still clinging to her sleeve, brushed past him one last time, and the sound of her footsteps slowly receded across the stone floor of the dark corridor. Ronan Gallagher remained standing beneath the yellow light of the Empire Room, facing a neatly folded apron and a 12-year-old document, both hands hanging at his sides, and for the first time in his adult life, the man who had built an empire by always knowing exactly what his next move would be had no idea what to do. Tessa didn't come to the bar the following night, or the night after that. Her resignation was emailed to Human Resources at 9 o'clock in the morning, brief, procedurally correct, without a single word of explanation, and her telephone rang into silence for everyone except one name in Trenton. Ronan knew before the morning was over, because nothing happened inside that building without reaching him, and for nearly an hour, the most powerful man in Atlantic City sat behind his desk on the highest floor, with every instrument power could purchase at his disposal. He could know where she was within 10 minutes, could have someone standing outside her door within 20, could transfer a number into her account large enough to open every door. could buy the building where she rented her home, the entire block, the silence, or the voice of anyone around her. He sat there with all those instruments arranged inside his mind, like surgical tools, and understood something 12 years of ruling a city had never taught him. There were things in this world that didn't belong on the list of what money could buy. And the woman who had folded her apron and placed it on the bar stood at the very top of the other list. So he did nothing. He didn't search for her, didn't have anyone follow her, didn't send flowers, didn't send gifts, and didn't ask Daisy to speak on his behalf, because he understood, with the belated instinct of a man learning a new language for the first time, that every gesture of that kind would only be power disguised as affection, and she would recognize it by the scent alone. He did only one thing. On the first night, at 3 o'clock in the morning, the black car stopped outside the rear entrance of the Meridian, and Ronan walked through the eastern corridor, pushed open the wooden door of the Empire Room, and entered the empty darkness. The bar lights were off, the bottles locked inside their cabinets, and the last stool sat motionless in the shadows exactly where it had always been. He lowered himself onto it, his back to the wall and his face toward the door, and he waited. No telephone, no documents, no coffee. Only one man sitting before an unattended bar inside a room that had been dead for 12 years, listening to the distant hum of the air conditioning and the city breathing beyond the walls. He stayed until 5 o'clock in the morning, then rose and left. On the second night, he returned at the same hour and sat on the same stool. On the third night, rain streamed down the lifeless windows of the abandoned wing, and he sat there with the dampness of the weather still clinging to his coat. Boyd remained outside the corridor through every one of those nights, at the precise distance shaped by 20 years of service, and witnessed something he had never seen during all those years. Not once, not even during deals suspended by a thread, not even on nights when the entire empire had tilted beneath them. His employer was waiting. Simply waiting. Waiting for something completely beyond his control, without a contingency plan, without a second option, without leverage hidden inside his sleeve, with nothing but a stool, a dark bar, and the naked, unarmed hope of an ordinary human being. On the fifth night, Boyd finally dared to ask as the car pulled away from the building, "How long do you intend to wait, sir?" Ronan looked through the window at the streetlights gleaming against the wet glass, and answered in the voice of a man responding to the simplest question in the world. "Until she comes back, or until she sends someone to tell me not to wait anymore." "And if neither of those things happens?" Boyd asked. "Then I have plenty of nights," Ronan said. The 6th night passed. The 7th night passed. On the 8th night, after Ronan had been sitting in the familiar darkness for almost an hour, his back already knowing every grain of wood in the stool, a soft click sounded behind him, and the yellow lights of the bar came alive, spilling across the wooden surface, over his shoulders, and into the room like a small dawn arriving early. He turned. Tessa stood behind the bar, her coat still on, her hair tied low as always, the shadows of sleepless nights beneath her eyes. Though those brown eyes remained as direct and clear as they had been on the first night, she looked at him across the wooden counter, where the apron she had folded into 4 sections still rested exactly where she had placed it 8 nights earlier, untouched because no one had dared move it. "You signed a paper without reading the names," she said, offering no greeting, going directly to the heart of it, as though the conversation from 8 nights earlier had only paused for a single breath. "This whole city signs papers like that every day. Banks sign them. City Hall signs them. Insurance companies sign them. Signatures that never read the names fall into people's lives like rain, and everyone calls it business. I've had 8 nights to think about that. 8 nights to separate 2 things I had always believed were the same: guilt and responsibility." She removed her coat, hung it on the hook behind the bar, picked up the folded apron, snapped it open with one decisive movement, slipped the strap over her neck, and tied the strings behind her back with hands that had performed the motion 1,000 times. "The guilt belongs to the 22-year-old boy who signed 30 papers after burying his brother," she continued, her hands still tightening the knot. "And I'm not cruel enough to make you carry that for the rest of your life. But the responsibility belongs to the man who learned the truth and chose to remain silent for 3 weeks. She placed both hands on the counter and looked directly at him, and now her voice slowed, each word laid down like a stone paving a road. "So I have one condition, only one, and it is everything. Never be silent with me again. No matter how bad the news is, no matter how much you think it will hurt me, No matter how badly you want to protect me, I've spent my whole life with men who kept silent to protect me. My father kept silent about the loans, and that silence took more from me than every truth ever could." Ronan looked at the woman before him, and when he answered, his voice wasn't flat, as it usually was. It was low and certain, like a foundation being laid. Never again. Those words had left Ronan Gallagher's mouth hundreds of times as orders, and dozens of times as contract terms. But that night, for the first time, they emerged in the shape of a vow, and both people standing beneath the yellow light heard the difference. Tessa gave one slow nod, sealing it. Then she turned, opened the cabinet, took down the bottle of Irish whiskey, and held a strip of orange peel over the small flame. The room that had been dead for 12 years came alive once more with the familiar scorched sweetness. She prepared the draught with movements neither hurried nor slow, set the glass on the counter, and pushed it toward him along the same place and the same worn path across the wood. "Tonight, I'm charging double," she said. The corner of Ronan Gallagher's mouth moved, the smallest lift at one side that she had learned to read over the past several weeks, the closest thing to a smile that man had preserved after 12 years. And that night, for the first time, it remained on his face longer than a single breath. 1 week later, on a rare, clear Saturday morning, the black car stopped outside Tessa's apartment building at 9 o'clock. And this time Ronan wasn't alone. Daisy was in the back seat, having been picked up early from the Trenton bus station. According to a plan, the 2 men in the car and the 19-year-old student had kept secret from Tessa for 3 full days. "Where are we going that requires this much secrecy?" Tessa asked as she climbed into the car, looking from her younger sister, who was smiling to herself, to the man wearing a suspiciously expressionless face, and neither of them answered. Daisy only nudged her sister's shoulder, turned toward the window, and whistled a melody with no beginning and no end. The car didn't travel far. It circled the block containing the Meridian, but instead of turning toward the familiar rear entrance, it stopped on the eastern side of the building, at the stretch of street Tessa had passed thousands of times without bothering to look at, where the dead windows of the Empire Room wing had been boarded over for 12 years. She stepped out of the car and froze on the sidewalk. The boards were gone. The row of windows had been replaced, the dark wooden frames polished, and above a separate entrance opening directly onto the street, a section of wall had been deliberately left empty, as though waiting for a sign whose name had yet to be chosen. Ronan opened the door, and Tessa entered the room she had believed she knew in every shadowed corner, only to realize she had never truly seen it, not once, because for 2 years she had known it only beneath the glow of one bar light, surrounded by darkness, while now, for the first time, the Empire Room was fully illuminated. The canvas had been removed from the stage, the wooden floor restored, new tables and chairs arranged neatly along both sides, and a small kitchen built farther inside, large enough to serve food to guests of every age. The entire room had been renovated into an independent space, completely separated from the gaming floor, with its own entrance and a life of its own. At the center of everything, restored but not replaced, stood the original wooden bar, still bearing the same scratches, the same faint scorch mark at the left corner where someone had once forgotten a cigarette before Tessa was even born, the same smooth path across the surface worn by tens of thousands of drinks, including nearly 700 of hers and several dozen drafts belonging to a man who sat on the last stool. They suggested replacing the bar. Ronan said behind her. I refused. Some things are valuable, because they are old. Tessa reached out and touched the wood, and before she could speak, Boyd appeared from the rear carrying a ring of old iron keys and a pair of bolt cutters. Ronan gave one nod. The service storage area and the row of lockers behind the stage, sealed exactly as they had been on the day the wing closed, were opened before her eyes. The 12-year-old lead seal was cut away. The iron door groaned for a long moment like the sound of time itself, and in the dusty light that poured through, a row of old employee lockers appeared along the wall like aging soldiers, still guarding a camp that had long since been abandoned. Locker number 17, Boyd said quietly, checking the diagram in his hand. Frank Monroe's. Tessa stood before the peeling gray metal door, her heart beating all the way into her throat, and when the locker opened, there was no gold or treasure inside, only an old uniform vest folded neatly, a tin case of bartending tools polished smooth by years of use, and resting on top, a brown leather notebook with every corner worn away, swollen from being filled with writing and tied shut with a leather cord. She lifted it with both hands. She knew it. Throughout her childhood, She had seen it tucked inside her father's coat, had watched him write in it after returning from every shift, and she had believed it had disappeared forever, along with everything else belonging to those days. Frank Monroe's recipe book had been lying in this darkness for 12 years, less than 20 steps from the place where his daughter had stood making drinks every night. They returned to the main room, where sunlight was pouring through the new windows, and on a table near the bar rested a thick contract folder and a pen. Ronan stood beside the table, and for the first time since Tessa had known him, he didn't look entirely steady. There was something in the set of his shoulders like a man standing before a wager that all the power in the world couldn't help him win. "A long-term lease," he said. "This entire space, legally and operationally, separate from the casino. All renovation and equipment costs have been paid in full. No debt, no hidden ownership, no condition tying it to me or to anything bearing the Gallagher name. It requires only one signature, and the name on the agreement is Tessa Monroe." He paused. "It belongs to you, no matter what you decide about the rest." Tessa looked at the contract, then at him. "What is the rest?" she asked. Though she already knew, she only wanted to hear him say it himself. Ronan Gallagher, a man who had negotiated with crime bosses and corporations without changing the rhythm of his heart, drew in a breath like someone preparing to step beyond the edge of the water, and spoke in a voice stripped of every layer of armor. "I spent 12 years building a world where nothing could reach me. No person, no debt, no weakness, nothing that could be taken away, and I called that safety. Then, one night, at 3 o'clock in the morning, I took a shortcut through a closed room and smelled something real for the first time in many years. Something that wasn't for sale, couldn't be bought, and didn't exist in any of my books." He looked directly into her eyes. "You are the first thing in a very long time that I have wanted to keep. Not own, keep. The way someone keeps a lamp burning through a night of hard wind." The room was very still. Daisy stood near the bar with both arms folded across her chest, her eyes red while her mouth struggled not to smile. Tessa studied the man before her for a long time, then spoke slowly and clearly. "Then listen to this, and listen carefully. Daisy remains outside your world. Completely. Never. No matter what happens, good or bad. She doesn't know, doesn't see, and doesn't touch anything belonging to the dark part of your life. That isn't a condition, Ronan. That is everything. She will never touch it," he said without a second of hesitation. "I swear." From the bar came the strained but deliberately casual voice of the 19-year-old student. "I'm standing right here, and I heard all of that. My opinion is that you should take it. The whole room. Him too." The girl sniffed once, then added, "Also, I'm hungry." A sound escaped Tessa that was half laughter and half tears. She quickly wiped the corner of one eye with the back of her hand and stepped toward the table. She picked up the pen, then her hand stopped above the agreement, and instead of signing, she set the pen down, pulled her father's worn leather notebook closer, untied the cord, and guided by an instinct she couldn't explain, the instinct of a child who had memorized every part of her parent, she didn't open to the first page. She turned directly to the last. The final page of the notebook wasn't like the others. The pages before it, which she had glimpsed as she turned through them, were dense with her father's familiar slanting handwriting, recipe after recipe, notes crowded into the margins about the tastes of individual regulars. Mr. Whitfield at table 7 preferred less sweetness. Mrs. Casey ordered 2 drinks every Friday, fragments of 20 years behind the bar, carefully gathered by one man the way someone might gather seeds. But the final page held only a single recipe, written more deliberately than anything else in the book, in darker ink, as though the man holding the pen had sat for a long time before the blank paper, before finally beginning. At the top, underlined twice, were the 3 words Tessa had carried inside her chest for 12 years. "The Boardwalk Ember." She read each line. "Irish whiskey, exactly as she remembered. Orange peel held over flame until the edges were sweetly scorched, exactly as she had done for nearly 700 nights. Smoked honey, 1 spoonful, no more. 3 turns of the spoon. Every detail matched her memory. Every amount, every motion. And then her eyes reached the 5th line. The line her memory didn't contain. The line her father had never had time to teach her, and the hand holding the edge of the page stopped. The 5th ingredient, written in that slanting hand, was 2 drops of orange blossom perfume from Marie's bottle. Marie. Tessa stood motionless in the sunlit room. Marie was her mother. She knew that bottle. She knew it as clearly as she knew her own hand. The small amber glass bottle that had always stood at the left corner of her mother's dressing table, the only inexpensive perfume her mother had worn throughout her life, smelling of orange and white blossoms, the scent that drifted from her hair whenever she bent to kiss her daughters before bed, the scent that still clung to the scarf she wrapped around her head in those final years when her hair was gone. 2 drops, from Marie's bottle. For 20 years, inside a magnificent casino filled with $1,000 bottles, the thing that had created the legendary cocktail people drove from other cities to drink, the secret ingredient none of her father's co-workers had ever guessed, hadn't been a rare liquor or an elaborate technique. It had been 2 drops of inexpensive perfume from a woman's dressing table. Her father had carried her mother into every drink he made. Every night for 20 years, a man standing behind a casino bar, surrounded by ringing slot machines and money-changing hands, had quietly mixed the love of his life into every glass and watched strangers drink it without knowing why warmth spread through them. Her father's secret had been her mother. It was as simple as that, and as immense as that. Beneath the recipe, separated by a space, was one final line in his slanting handwriting, smaller and less steady, written by a father rather than a bartender. For Tessa, when you find the person who makes you want to make this drink for them. The room was so quiet she could almost hear the dust drifting through the sunlight. Tessa stared at those words, and 12 years rearranged themselves inside her mind over the course of only a few heartbeats. She had tried hundreds of times. She had chased the 5th ingredient through slices of ginger, sprigs of rosemary, drops of oil, and night after night of asking closer or farther away. Every draft had been almost right. Desperately almost right. Because she had been searching for an ingredient when the missing thing had never been an ingredient at all. The missing thing was a person, someone standing on the other side of the bar to whom she wanted to give that drink, wanted it so deeply that every drop inside the glass changed its meaning. Her father hadn't failed to finish teaching her the recipe because he had run out of time. The final part of this recipe couldn't be taught. It had to arrive on its own, and he had written the answer here in advance, waiting for his daughter to travel the full length of her own road. Then she understood the last piece. She understood why that drop of cold-pressed orange oil had made her freeze, why the draft had come so close that it frightened her and she had lied, saying farther away. Tonight it's farther away. That night, the drink hadn't moved closer to her father's recipe. She had moved closer to another person, and the fear inside her had recognized it before her heart did. The tears came without warning. There was no sobbing, no trembling of her shoulders, only 2 silent streams spilling over and running straight down her face, as though they had been standing in line behind that door for 12 years, and now had only to step through. Tessa Monroe, who had remained standing through her mother's funeral, her father's funeral, the debt collection calls, and the 16-hour days, stood inside her father's sunlit room and wept, only once, and only briefly, over a page of paper. Ronan said nothing. He didn't offer her a handkerchief, didn't touch her shoulder, and didn't reach for any of the clumsy words of comfort humanity had accumulated over the centuries. He simply left his place beside the table, walked over, and stood beside her, close enough for the shoulder of his coat to brush lightly against hers, steady and silent as a wall against the wind, because that man might not have known how to speak, but he had learned from her that being present at the right moment was a language of its own. Daisy stood near the bar with both hands covering her mouth, tears flowing freely without any attempt to hide them. After a while, Tessa drew in a long breath and wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. A neat, decisive motion, like folding a cloth. Then she placed the open notebook on the table beside the contract, allowing the 2 things to rest together, her father's legacy and her own future. She picked up the pen. This time, her hand didn't stop. She signed her name, Tessa Monroe, the signature straight and clear like the woman herself, on the waiting line. Then she raised her head, looked toward the last stool standing in the sunlight like an old soldier newly awarded a medal, and then at the man beside her. On opening night, she said, her voice still slightly rough but steady once more, I'll make the first drink, and this time, I won't pour it away. Opening night arrived on a Friday evening near the end of January, and they called it a soft opening, which meant there were no guests yet, no illuminated sign above the door, no sound of glasses touching in a crowd. Only 3 people inside the room warmed by yellow light, while Boyd stood near the entrance with the posture of a guard and the eyes of someone who belonged to the family. The Empire Room was beautiful that night, in a way no designer could ever have created. It was beautiful because it had come back to life. The new wooden floor still carried the scent of polish. The silent rows of tables and chairs waited for the stories that would soon arrive. And the old bar, 20 years of age, stood at the center of everything like a heart that had begun beating again. Tessa stepped into the space behind the main bar, not the service corner where she had worked for nearly 2 years, but the central position, exactly where her father had stood for 20 years, where the wooden floor had been worn smooth in the shape of 2 feet that had occupied the same place through tens of thousands of nights. When her own feet settled into those worn impressions, and fit with a strange perfection, she had to pause for one breath. She placed her father's worn leather notebook on the counter and opened it to the final page, though she already knew every word, because tonight wasn't a night for making the drink from memory. Tonight was a night for making it with him. Daisy stood on the other side of the bar, with both hands resting on the wood, her eyes shining, and on the counter before her sat the small amber glass bottle she had found 3 days earlier, inside a box of their mother's keepsakes, stored on top of a cabinet in the old apartment. More than half of the orange blossom perfume remained, preserved by their mother's careful use during her final years, as though she had known it would still be needed for something afterward. Tessa began. She held the orange peel over the small flame until the oils hissed and released a halo of sweet, scorched fragrance. Dropped it into the glass. Measured 1 spoonful of thick smoked honey the color of dark amber. Poured the Irish whiskey in a thin, even stream and stirred exactly 3 times. Then, when she reached the step where her hand had stopped for nearly 700 nights, she didn't stop. She lifted her mother's bottle, opened it, and the fragrance that escaped made all 3 people in the room fall silent. Orange and white blossoms, the scent of kisses before bedtime. Tessa tilted the bottle, slowly and steadily, and 1 drop, then 2, fell into the drink like the final 2 notes of a song that had waited 12 years to be played in full. She gave it 1 last gentle stir, and the first complete boardwalk ember in 12 years stood on the old wooden counter, shimmering beneath the yellow light and releasing the fragrance that had once made a man taking a shortcut through a dark room stop in his tracks. Tessa poured the remaining drink from the mixing glass into a second glass. Then she did 2 things. First, she pushed the first drink along the polished path worn into the wood, all the way down the length of the bar, until it came to rest neatly before the last stool, Ronan's place, where he sat exactly as he had on the first night, his back to the wall and his face toward the door, though tonight his gray eyes weren't watching the entrance. They were looking only at her. Second, she raised the remaining glass to the level of her face and turned it toward the empty space in the middle of the room, toward the vacant tables that would soon be filled with people, toward the worn place beneath her feet, and gently touched her glass against the air, a silent toast to the old bartender of the Empire Room, who somehow, as all 3 of them could feel that night, was standing very close by in the fragrance of burned orange peel. Ronan lifted the drink. He tasted it, and he closed his eyes for 2 seconds, something he had never done in front of anyone in his life, because the flavor didn't enter through his tongue. It went directly into the part of his chest he had frozen for 12 years, and she had slowly thawed night after night. When he opened his eyes, he spoke the briefest and truest sentence in this entire story. "Now I understand why people waited in line until midnight." The following morning, the 3 of them sat inside the familiar diner across the boulevard at the table beside the window. Clear winter sunlight falling across the plastic surface, and everything was so ordinary that it felt sacred. Daisy raised her glass of orange juice and delivered a serious explanation of why pancakes had to be stacked 3 layers high so the butter would melt evenly. Ronan listened with the concentration of a man receiving an important financial report, and Tessa sat beside him, smiling her unguarded smile. Then, in the middle of their laughter, her hand found his on the tabletop, settled over it, and didn't pull away again. The most precious things in this world never arrive with noise. They come like a fragrance drifting through an empty room at 3 o'clock in the morning, like a drink made from the memories of those who are gone, like someone who quietly returns night after night and waits before an unlit bar. True love is the same. It doesn't arrive to rescue anyone. It simply stands beside us, patient and steady, long enough for us to find the courage to finish what we once left incomplete, whether it is a drink, a dream, or a heart that has closed itself away. Because sometimes, what is missing from the recipe of our lives was never an ingredient at all, but a person worthy of receiving the drink we are finally ready to complete. If this story has touched your heart, please subscribe to our channel, leave a like, and share this video so we can continue listening to more compelling stories every day. How did the story of Tessa and Ronan make you feel? And which moment moved you most deeply? Please write your thoughts in the comments below. We sincerely hope to hear the feelings that come from the deepest part of your heart. Thank you for staying with us until these final words. May you and your family always enjoy good health, a joyful life, and peace and serenity in every day ahead. Goodbye, and we'll see you again in the next video.